So we're going to look at the cognitive interview, that is a technique used to enhance recall in eyewitness testimony. The idea is that Fisher looked at standard police interviews that you will be comparing the cognitive interview with, or you might be asked explicitly to do so. And they found that the questions were closed, brief. The sequencing of the question was dictated by the interviewer rather than the witness. And the police often interrupted, and they had a kind of agenda of their own, and therefore you could say that they were leading questions in some way. So in comparison to the standard interview, the cognitive interview does not have a specific standardized list of questions, is not time limited, will last significantly longer than a standard interview. It's mainly about the witness talking, with the interviewer only giving some prompts very rarely and asking for clarification and elaboration, and the questions are open. Now, it uses 4 techniques, but just before we look at the techniques, and when you present the cognitive interview, if you get an essay on it, you want to talk about the underlying principles of the techniques rather than just listing the techniques completely out of context. You're saying that this is a series of techniques used to enhance eyewitness testimony, so you have to explain the underlying theory as to why these techniques would enhance recall rather than just listing the techniques and saying what they are. You have to know the techniques in detail, mainly because you might get applied questions where you're asked to use some techniques, either techniques of your choice, or they might tell you which techniques to use. However, if you're writing an essay, listing the techniques in details and giving examples lacks the depth of understanding of what the cognitive interview does and why. So here are the 2 principles of memory that are used to develop the 4 techniques. Are context dependency, so you remember retrieval failure as a theory for forgetting because of the absence of cues. So because memories are linked to situations, external and internal cues that were present during encoding, at recall, the techniques that we will see that are context reinstatement and report everything try to enhance the ability to access these retrieval cues and therefore have access to memories about the event that might otherwise be lost. On the other hand, schema theory is the idea that we've got a fixed set of ideas about how an event might unfold that might bias our recall. If you remember Loftus and Palmer's car crash accident, asking leading questions such as how fast were the cars going when they were smashed, hit, collided, and that changing the recall of events. In the same way, we might have a mind idea of what a criminal might look like. So if we forget details, we'll just replace them with what we think is most likely to be there. So changing the order and changing the perspective are the 2 techniques that, as it says, because they're shifting the natural kind of schema of how someone would tell the events, they might also shift away from the other schemas associated with their pre-existing beliefs subconsciously of how the events should have unfolded, making them more likely to recall things differently. So something different from what they would remember in the standard interview. So then very quickly, context reinstatement. Imagine if you are presenting this and giving an example or asked to do it in an applied setting, you don't just say they'll be asked to remember the scene of the crime. Be specific. If it was a robbery, remember what the weather was like, if they were outdoors, the surrounding, what shops they could see on the high street, for example. Be very specific, and it can be external cues or internal cues, how they were feeling, what they were thinking, etc. Report everything is no matter how irrelevant it might seem. So things such as, what did you eat for breakfast? What were you wearing that day? Things that seem to be unrelated to the crime, but in reality might then connect up to other memories of that day, eventually bringing to relevant information about the crime. Changing the perspective, again, if you're asked to do this in an applied setting, don't just say someone else, looking at it from someone else's perspective. Say something specific. Like, for example, they will have told you that there was a crowd of witnesses. It could be another witness, or it could be from the point of view of the offender, or from the point of view of the victim. And then changing the order, you could say, for example, rather than telling the story chronologically, work your way either from the end backwards or from the most memorable event and then work around it. Again, just to change this mindset of how things should be. So this is extra, you don't need to know it, it's just mentioned in the mark scheme. So in the enhanced cognitive interview, Fisher added the kind of more psychological dimension of rapport. So developing rapport between the interviewer and the interviewee in order to put them at ease and enhance their ability to access information because of what we know about the impact of anxiety on eyewitness testimony. Now, moving on to evaluation, you can use research evidence showing to what extent the cognitive interview has been found to generate more correct information, but also potentially more incorrect information because it's asking witnesses to use their imagination sometimes. And then you talk about the extent to which this can and will be used in real life by police officers and detectives, and that's doing a cost-benefit analysis because obviously the cognitive interview is more time-consuming, more costly, that it requires training, so we need to see whether the benefits of the extra information outweigh the costs, both economical and in terms of time. So you've got a meta-analysis on 50 studies that did show a 34% increase in the amount of correct information. You want to remember some figures. Just saying it was better is too vague and would not be credit-worthy. The percentage is more important than the name. Then we've got Geiselman's study using a video as a stimulus and students as participants. That's significant because you might comment on the population validity of the findings later on. As you can see, the correct items were significantly higher in the cognitive interview compared to standard. And although there was a slightly higher amount of incorrect items and confabulated items, that means they made them up, that difference wasn't found to be significant. Now, that's something that you can pick up on, that although it wasn't significant, it's still potentially a cost that you're incurring to run this interview that might also generate slightly incorrect information, and that would be part of that cost-benefit analysis. As we see, this is linked to what you can say about the specific techniques. If you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, and we know that actually context reinstatement and report everything, that's what CR and RE stand for, seem to be the most effective combination. So you could argue that because it's so time-consuming and so costly, maybe not all the techniques are necessary, and in real life the use of the cognitive interview might not be as intended originally. So that's how you could link it back. You don't have to say just that it's bad or good. You can nuance your link back by saying it's a cost-benefit analysis. There might be a revised version of the cognitive interview that's more likely to be used. Another thing that we can mention is the validity of the findings that the cognitive interview's success is based on. If some of the findings are based on artificial stimuli and student participants, we can question the extent to which they can be strong enough findings to then justify the investment of the police in using the cognitive interview. There's also the element of individual differences. That means that the success of the cognitive interview seems to be higher for older witnesses rather than younger. It makes sense that asking young people to imagine a different perspective might send them in a whole journey of imagination, making the cognitive interview generate more incorrect than correct information. So again, you might conclude that the cognitive interview needs to be used with caution and adapted to the type of witness that you're interviewing. Ultimately, there is evidence that in the real world, with real detective using real crime witnesses, the cognitive interview, the enhanced cognitive interview was highly successful, and that increased the amount of information compared to the standard interview. The issue is that the training and investment that is required is so high that it's only available to certain more wealthy maybe officers, police officers and boroughs. So that also might shed doubt over whether the effectiveness of the cognitive interview in real life is also linked to economic advantages of certain boroughs, and therefore the ability to run these interviews. So in real life, the barriers are not only about questioning whether it works or not, but also whether it's viable, considering all the details that need to be considered and the time that needs to be spent on training and on actually running it.